Making a living. Anthropologists have long had an interest in the way in which cultures gather their and raise and produce their food because it influences so many other things within a society. And we're going to explore some of those things today in part one and part two of this series on making a living. We start with talking about the idea of adaptive strategies and what that means. We'll look at some of the various subsistence technologies, such as foraging, cultivation, pastoralism. We'll talk about modes of production, as well as economizing and maximization. And finally, we'll look at the ideas of distribution and exchange. As we move on, we'll look at what the major adaptive strategies are that we find in non industrial societies. We'll explore what is an economy and what is economizing behavior, the principles that regulate the exchange of goods and services in various societies. Adaptive strategies. With the advent of food production, major changes came about in human life. One of the things that we know about humans that is because of the ability to adapt to the environment and various situations that things began to change, that cultures started to develop, and a lot of things that we take for granted first began as a result of and continue as the ability that we have to adapt to our environment, our surroundings, and things that happen. That with those adaptive strategies came larger social and political systems that eventually led to states, which we recognize and know. Yehudi Cohen uses the term adaptive strategy to describe a group system of economic production. And he created a typology of societies based on the correlation between economies and social features. So we're going to look at, based upon the particular society, its food gathering or its subsistence technology, and what kinds of characteristics we can see that are part of those things. For example, foraging cultures, horticulture, agriculture, pastoralism, and industrialism. We begin with foraging. One such group would be the San, the Dobe Johansi San. They're found in southern Africa, generally in an area where there's a waterless belt of land. There are still some estimated 100,000 San that live in poverty on the fringes of society. In Botswana, the government relocated them outside of the ancestral territory to create a wildlife area, which caused a large uproar among many communities around the world. And eventually, they, on behalf of the San Bushmen, which sometimes they're called, took the government to court, and the court reversed the order, and they were allowed to regain access back to their lands. Some of the things that we find in foraging, and we're going to talk about correlation, which is an association, a covariation between two or more variables. Foraging groups tend to be very mobile because they have to go where the food is. People who subsist by hunting, gathering, and fishing tend to live in band organized societies. Mobility is, we mentioned, typical of those foraging societies. And another thing that we will find in many of them are fictive kinships. And fictive kinships can be thought of in this way. If you think about in cultures in the United States, for example, and you'll hear people make references to having a play mother or a play sister or other people that there is a close relationship, and people will use terms to claim um, a relationship based on the kinship model when there's not actually a real relationship in terms of either by blood or marriage. But again, there's that close connection. That's what we call a fictive kinship. And it's very common in foraging societies. And we also look at the fact that we've talked about that in societies there's a division of labor that's based upon gender. And a lot of times, why relating back to fictive kinship this happens is because you will have within foraging communities sometimes part of the group that will go off on a hunt for a while, and you may have the case where fathers may leave their children or mothers may leave their children, and it's upon other people that are a part of the group or the band to look after and to relate to the children, and also when it comes to sharing the resources that are found. Foragers also make social distinctions based on age. We turn now to cultivating. Horticulture is different from foraging in that it is talking about having land or helping land to produce on a very small scale. It's cultivation that makes intensive use of none of the factors of production, which we'll talk about later, but in terms of land, labor, capital, and machinery. Horticulturalists use simple tools. The fields where they plant and harvest their crops and their food are not permanently cultivated, but rather they use what we call shifting cultivation or slash and burn cultivation. What happens is that a horticultural group will use an area or a plot of land for a particular period of time until that land no longer is productive and fertile. And then what they will do is they will burn the vegetation, cut the vegetation and things down and burn it and move on and allow the land to remain what's called fallow for a while. And the burned vegetation and all of that will replenish the earth, remineralize the earth, and then they will come back at a later point and then again begin planting in that area. But there's not permanently cultivated fields or plots of land in the way that we'll see that are involved in agriculture. In agriculture, that's cultivation that requires more labor than horticulture does. It uses land intensively and continuously. So rather than going through periods of land where it's fallow and all of that, and the food production technology of agriculture, land is used intensively and continuously. There are domesticated animals that are also used in the process of agricultural production, and then irrigation systems that are installed or used as a part of the technology to ensure that the land produces. And agriculturalists will cultivate the same plot of land year after year, again, in contrast to horticulturalists who use it for a while until it's no longer useful, slash, burn, shift, move on, and maybe return later. Where in agriculture, there's the use of the land over and over again. There are chemicals and other things that are very oftentimes added to the land, pesticides and all of that to ensure that the land continues to produce. And that requires a large capital investment, but a part of the idea is that over time, the land is going to increase in value. Terracing, and that's where societies are using labor that's necessary to build and maintain a system of terraces. When we look at the cost and benefits of agriculture, we know that in these cases of agriculture that the long-term yield per area is far greater and more dependable than horticulture because there are certain techniques and because of other things that are used in the pursuit of making these lands continuously fertile, continuously productive, that over the long term, the yield per area is going to be much greater. And as a result, those agricultural societies tend to be more densely populated than horticultural ones because the land is able to support much better large populations of people. And year after year, there's going to be food, and we get into the whole idea of the food being stored at some point and other things that happen to ensure longevity with regard to those cultures and civilizations. So um, they tend to be more densely populated than horticultural ones. And then there are some economies that combine both the features of horticultural and agricultural methods or means on the cultivation continuum. One of the things we know is that horticulture always uses a fallow period and agriculture doesn't. And then there are some um, economies that kind of do a little bit of both. This is the main form of cultivation that's found in parts of Africa, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, Mexico, Central America, and South American tropical forests. This ends part one of making a living. Foraging societies, which are also many times called hunting and gathering societies, but foraging economies relied on nature to make their living. That the things that they could gather, such as nuts, berries, tubers, all of those things that are come from the ground or from trees and plants and bushes. But not only that, but also um, hunting and fishing, what could be gained from one's environment in that way. But foragers rely on the natural resources of subsistence and not controlling plant and animal reproduction in the way that some of the other communities that we will see have done. Foraging still is alive and well in some parts of the world. It's survived mainly in those environments that have had major obstacles to food production because either the soil, um, places where there are periods of drought, and other things that have influenced and inhibited the expansion of those societies.